The manager threw the steaming coffee onto the polished floor and shouted, "Clean it up right now, you useless employee." Catherine smiled in absolute silence, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. In exactly 2 hours, that very same woman would be sitting in a leather chair, struggling to breathe, silently regretting every cruel word she had ever spoken, as she faced her inevitable termination. Catherine was the majority owner of the entire enterprise. Monday arrived, as Mondays always do in massive corporate fortresses, carrying the bitter scent of dark roasted coffee, the hurried clicking of designer heels against cold marble, and the suffocating tension of hundreds of people who would rather be anywhere else. Apex Conglomerate occupied the 12th, 13th, and 14th floors of one of the most imposing glass skyscrapers in the financial district of Chicago. Its towering windows reflected the turbulent gray waters of Lake Michigan, standing as a proud monument to modern capitalism, projecting an image of untouchable perfection to the bustling city below. Catherine Edwards arrived at the loading dock at exactly 6:47 in the morning. She did not arrive in the sleek black town car she normally used to navigate the busy Chicago streets. She did not arrive with her executive assistant carrying her meticulously organized daily agenda, nor did she use the private executive elevator requiring a biometric scan that only she and the senior board members possessed. Instead, she slipped through the reinforced steel service doors with a frayed canvas backpack slung over her shoulder, wearing a dark blue industrial uniform that hung loosely on her slender frame. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, simple bun that perfectly disguised the striking face that had graced the cover of the National Business Times just 3 months earlier, under the bold headline of the 30 most powerful women in corporate America. Nobody recognized her, nobody gave her a second glance, and that was precisely the perfect invisibility Catherine desperately needed. The troubling mystery had begun 6 weeks prior, during a tense quarterly board meeting, where the operational metrics simply refused to align with the human reality. Apex Conglomerate was highly profitable, generating massive revenue streams, but there was a dark, unquantifiable anomaly festering beneath the spreadsheets. Internal human resources surveys showed employee satisfaction plummeting in a terrifying freefall. The staff turnover rate had spiked to 42% in the past 8 months alone, a staggering hemorrhage of talent. 3 of their most brilliant financial analysts had resigned abruptly without offering any concrete explanations during their exit interviews. When independent corporate recruiters tracked their career movements, they discovered that all 3 had accepted positions at rival Chicago firms for essentially the same compensation packages. They had not abandoned Apex for better money. They had fled from something toxic, something that the sterile corporate reports could not capture. Catherine had discreetly commissioned a highly confidential investigation by an external consulting firm renowned for corporate psychology. The final result was delivered in a plain manila envelope containing a single sheet of heavy paper that stated the brutal truth in cold, uncompromising letters. The text declared that the problem was not structural, but rather fundamentally human, and it was deeply rooted in the middle management tier. That vague assessment was entirely insufficient for a woman of her caliber. Catherine Edwards was not the type of executive who made sweeping organizational changes based on abstract paragraphs. She was the type of relentless leader who needed to witness the rot with her own eyes, to feel the ambient temperature of the room, and to understand the suffering from the inside before executing a permanent solution. She had learned this vital lesson from her late father, Richard Edwards, who had built the Apex empire from a tiny hardware store in the suburbs into one of the most formidable business conglomerates in the United States. He always warned her never to trust what people polished for the boardroom, but to trust only what she observed in the shadows. She had orchestrated the entire undercover operation with absolute, ironclad discretion. Only 3 trusted individuals in the entire world knew exactly what she was doing. Her fiercely loyal executive assistant, Matthew, her brilliant chief legal counsel, Eleanor Moore, and her oldest childhood friend, who had no ties to the business. Not even the venerable members of the board of directors were aware of her dual existence. She had meticulously fabricated a watertight paper identity. She became Catherine Evans, a newly hired janitorial worker assigned through a massive temporary staffing agency that Apex Conglomerate regularly contracted for building maintenance. The background documents were impeccably forged but technically real in the system. The hiring process had been identically standard, and nobody in the sprawling human resources department had raised a single eyebrow when the paperwork crossed their desks. Her first official shift as a phantom employee began today. The overnight supervisor tasked with receiving her at the subterranean service entrance was a young woman named Dorothy, who appeared to be about 25 years old. Dorothy possessed deeply bruised, dark circles under her eyes and a practiced, hollow smile designed specifically to mask chronic exhaustion. She handed Catherine a standard welcome kit consisting of a cheap plastic name badge bearing her fabricated alias, a heavily laminated procedures manual, and a pair of thick blue latex gloves. Dorothy welcomed her in a flat, mechanical voice that sounded as though it had been recorded 1,000 times before. She explained that Catherine's designated territory was the 12th floor, encompassing the executive restrooms, the sprawling corridors, the secondary boardroom, and the north wing kitchenette. Dorothy added a crucial warning, stating that the direct floor manager was Margaret Vance, a woman who arrived precisely at 8 o'clock and despised being addressed. Before consuming her second cup of dark roast coffee, Catherine nodded with a serene, unreadable expression and politely asked if there was anything else she needed to know before beginning her shift. Dorothy paused, her eyes darting nervously as she evaluated whether it was safe to share a deeper, more dangerous truth with a stranger. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, adopting the tone of someone sharing a grim survival tactic that everyone understood, but nobody dared to articulate. Dorothy warned that there were invisible, brutal rules on that floor that were never printed in any corporate handbook, and that Catherine's continued employment depended entirely on learning them quickly. Before Catherine could press for further details, Dorothy spun around and rushed down the concrete corridor toward her next logistical crisis. Catherine carefully tucked the plastic badge into the oversized pocket of her blue uniform and gripped the heavy metal handle of her assigned cleaning cart. It was a cumbersome, squeaking contraption, loaded with 4 brightly colored plastic buckets and an array of potent industrial sprays, labeled in thick, permanent marker. She pushed the heavy cart toward the echoing service elevator, ready to descend into the corporate abyss. As the heavy metal doors of the service elevator slid shut, Catherine spent the slow ascent to the 12th floor, staring intently at her own distorted reflection in the scratched steel. She barely recognized the tired, anonymous woman staring back at her, or perhaps she did recognize her from a distant, humbler past she had almost forgotten. Long before she acquired prestigious business degrees, before she commanded intimidating boardrooms, before her elegant signature authorized transactions worth millions of dollars, she had been just Catherine. She had been a young, determined girl who spent her weekends helping her father count dusty inventory boxes, learning how to decipher complex accounting ledgers long before she learned how to drive a car. She was the same girl who used to fall asleep on massive stacks of textbooks, dreaming of building a monumental legacy without knowing that the empire she would eventually shape would bear her own family's name. She firmly reminded herself that in this confined space, she was simply Catherine Evans, a silent worker, with no voice and no power. The 12th floor was exactly what one would expect from an elite financial institution viewed from the sterile safety of a promotional brochure. It was sleek, aggressively modern, flooded with cold, natural light from the massive Chicago skyline windows, and strategically dotted with expensive, exotic decorative plants. However, the first thing Catherine registered was not the expensive interior design or the flawless lighting. It was the suffocating, heavy atmosphere. There was a palpable, vibrating tension suspended in the air between the identical cubicles, a silent dread that could never be photographed or quantified in a cheerful human resources climate report. The employees rarely spoke, avoided all unnecessary eye contact, and navigated the carpeted aisles with their heads slightly bowed, as if standing too tall might attract a dangerous predator. It was the specific type of toxic environment that takes years of systematic oppression to build, created drop by drop until people simply forget what it feels like to breathe freely. Catherine commenced her physical labor in total silence, methodically sweeping the long hallways, vigorously sanitizing the porcelain fixtures in the restrooms, and restocking the heavy reams of paper in the North Wing printing station. Nobody offered a friendly greeting. Nobody looked directly at her face. She was practically invisible, experiencing a profound societal erasure she had never encountered in her privileged adult life. Yet, this complete lack of presence, far from wounding her pride, rapidly transformed into her most devastating tactical weapon. From her ignored position behind the squeaking janitorial cart, Catherine possessed the unparalleled ability to observe absolutely everything. She listened to frantic, hushed conversations that no terrified employee would ever dare hold in the presence of a senior executive. She overheard two senior analysts whispering frantically in the corridor about a junior colleague who had suffered a severe panic attack in a bathroom stall the previous Friday. The stories she absorbed while quietly wiping down the marble countertops painted a horrifying picture of daily psychological warfare. She heard a pale administrative assistant complaining in a shaking voice that he had been waiting 3 agonizing months for approval on vacation days legally guaranteed by his employment contract. The dreaded name of Margaret Vance was whispered in at least 4 separate, terrified conversations, always accompanied by a sudden, anxious glance over the shoulder to ensure the corridors were clear. It was as though the mere utterance of the manager's name summoned a dark cloud over the cubicles, carrying a heavy, punishing weight that pressed down on the shoulders of every single worker. At exactly 3 minutes past 8 o'clock in the morning, the oppressive silence deepened dramatically, as Margaret Vance finally stepped onto the 12th floor. Catherine watched her arrival from the shadows of the hallway, her hands resting calmly on the wooden handle of her mop. Margaret appeared to be in her early 40s, with severely straightened dark hair, wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit that undoubtedly cost more than her subordinates earned in an entire month. She carried an expression of permanent, aggressive disgust, radiating the toxic belief that everyone around her was fundamentally incompetent and only her iron will kept the department from collapsing. She stalked through the open-plan office like a conqueror surveying a conquered territory, her sharp heels clicking a terrifying rhythm on the hard floors. She coldly ignored greetings from 6 different people, finally halting abruptly in front of a young receptionist who was frantically sorting a stack of chaotic financial documents. Without offering a basic morning greeting, Margaret stated with a perfectly calibrated, icy cruelty that the weekly report was due at exactly 8 o'clock, and the clock now read 3 minutes past the hour. The terrified young woman opened her mouth, her eyes wide with panic, wearing the desperate expression of someone who had mentally rehearsed a desperate apology during her entire agonizing commute. Before a single syllable could escape her trembling lips, Margaret cut her off, her voice slicing through the quiet office like a surgical blade. Margaret declared that she had absolutely no interest in pathetic excuses, demanding only that the completed file materialize in her digital inbox within the next 60 seconds. Without waiting for a response, the manager pivoted and continued her march toward her private glass-walled office with the exact same arrogant posture, treating the devastating emotional impact she left behind as completely irrelevant. Catherine remained perfectly still, continuing to push her damp mop across the floor in slow, rhythmic circles, absorbing every detail of the psychological destruction. She had finally witnessed the bleeding heart of her company's failure, and she understood precisely why her empire was quietly dying. That first evening, locked inside the quiet sanctuary of her luxurious Gold Coast apartment, Catherine did not remove her cheap blue uniform for a very long time. She sat on her expensive velvet sofa, holding the flimsy plastic badge bearing the name Catherine Evans, staring at it until her vision blurred. It was a worthless, disposable rectangle of plastic, the kind of object that eventually gets lost in the dark corners of a junk drawer or tossed into a landfill without a second thought. Yet, it felt incredibly heavy in her hands, carrying the immense weight of the invisible people who kept her massive company functioning every single day. She thought of her father, Richard Edwards, who had passed away just as the company began its meteoric rise to national dominance. He had bequeathed her the Apex conglomerate, but more importantly, he had left her the unshakable conviction that a business is entirely composed of its people, not its profit margins. Catherine spent the following days mastering her physical routine with an unexpected, methodical grace. She arrived every single morning at exactly 6:47, retrieved her squeaking metal cart from the damp basement, and ascended to the 12th floor to begin her ghost-like patrol. She quickly memorized which specific chemical cleaner was meant for the porous granite, which potent spray caused a severe allergic reaction for the asthmatic accountant near the windows, and how to fix the notoriously temperamental coffee machine. But beyond the physical labor, she became a master student of the unspoken, terrifying sociology of the office floor. She deciphered the invisible hierarchy that dictated who was allowed to speak, who was forced to remain silent, and how fear operated as the primary currency of management. She realized that certain cubicles were treated as dangerous, irradiated zones, where approaching without explicit permission invited an immediate, vicious reprimand from the management office. The veteran employees, those who had miraculously survived Margaret's reign for more than a year, had developed a complex language of subtle facial tics and panicked eye movements. A sharp dart of the eyes toward the glass office meant danger was approaching. A slow, defeated blink signaled a devastating rejection of a basic request. The entire ecosystem was built on the constant, exhausting anticipation of an unprovoked attack. Every single night, Catherine returned to her silent apartment, brewing a cup of herbal tea that she invariably allowed to turn ice-cold while she wrote furiously in a thick black notebook. She documented everything with the ruthless precision of a corporate auditor. Dates, specific times, verbatim cruelties, the names of the victims, and the visible physical toll the stress exacted on their exhausted bodies. It was a profoundly draining exercise, as each filled page was a damning indictment of her own failure to protect the people who built her wealth. By the second week, Catherine had crystallized her understanding of the two distinct, horrifying types of invisibility operating within the walls of her own building. The first was the invisibility of the disposable worker, her current disguise, the people who scrubbed the toilets and emptied the trash, completely ignored until a single speck of dust offended a manager. This was the traditional blindness of the corporate world, painful but predictably standard. However, the second type of invisibility was far more sinister and fundamentally destructive to the human soul. This was the invisibility of the white-collar professionals, the dedicated analysts and loyal coordinators, who were seen by Margaret Vance only as mechanical extensions of a spreadsheet. They were stripped of their humanity, denied the basic right to feel fatigue, grief, or overwhelm, reduced entirely to the cold, hard metrics they could produce before Friday evening. The most terrifying revelation was not the sudden, explosive anger of Margaret Vance, but rather the chilling, absolute consistency of her emotional cruelty. There were no unpredictable mood swings, no rare days of accidental kindness that offered the staff a brief moment to catch their breath. Her behavior was a continuous, unbroken line of calculated pressure, proving that this was not a temperamental flaw, but a deeply held, twisted management philosophy. Margaret genuinely believed that terror was the only effective tool for extracting maximum productivity, and that basic human empathy was a pathetic weakness that compromised the quarterly profit margins. As Catherine scrubbed the grout in the executive washroom, she realized that defeating a philosophy was infinitely more complicated than simply firing an angry employee. She needed to tear out the roots of this toxic culture before it strangled the rest of the company. The true depths of Margaret's destructive ideology were exposed on a gray Wednesday morning. just before the lunch hour provided a brief, desperate respite for the staff. Catherine was quietly polishing the brass handles of the secondary boardroom when the heavy wooden door drifted slightly open, allowing voices to slip into the quiet hallway. She immediately recognized Margaret's sharp, commanding tone slicing through the air. Margaret was arguing with a visiting human resources representative, stating unequivocally that she did not care about the corporate wellness guidelines or the mandatory mental health protocols. She declared that if a senior analyst missed their projected targets by a single fraction of a percent, they would be immediately terminated and replaced without a second of hesitation. The representative attempted to interject, stammering something about reasonable context and the unprecedented market volatility affecting the current financial models. Margaret laughed, a cold, dry sound completely devoid of any real amusement or warmth. She leaned over the heavy mahogany table, her voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute whisper that Catherine could hear perfectly from the corridor. She stated that context was simply the pathetic excuse of a guaranteed failure, and that she only accepted flawless solutions, absolutely never explanations. Catherine remained perfectly still, her hands gripping the yellow polishing cloth, feeling a cold surge of profound anger radiating through her chest. The pattern was flawlessly documented in her black notebook. A predatory manager who actively punished truth, criminalized context, and rewarded only silent, terrifying compliance. It was a parasitic model that artificially inflated short-term numbers while secretly hollowing out the actual intellectual capital of the enterprise. That night, Catherine did not write extensive paragraphs detailing the psychological abuse she had witnessed. She only needed to write a few words. She sat in the darkness of her living room, watching the distant, glittering lights of the Chicago skyline, reflecting off the dark surface of the lake. She thought about the human cost of her own ignorance, the devastating price paid by the talented people she had promised to lead and protect. She understood that identifying the tumor was only the first step. The extraction had to be swift, publicly undeniable, and absolutely terminal for the abuser. She opened the black notebook, picked up her heavy silver fountain pen, and inscribed a single, decisive sentence on a fresh white page. The evidence was finally complete. The trap was meticulously designed, and the time for passive observation was officially over. The inevitable breaking point, the moment that would irrevocably alter the destiny of the 12th floor, arrived on a bleak Thursday morning. Nobody in the open plan office saw the storm gathering, although in retrospect, every single employee would admit that a violent collision was mathematically guaranteed. Catherine was stationed in the North Wing kitchenette, meticulously scrubbing the porous granite countertops with a lemon-scented chemical spray, moving with her usual, practiced invisibility. Suddenly, Ashley, a brilliant 28-year-old financial analyst, rushed into the small room, her breathing shallow and erratic. Ashley possessed a naturally radiant smile that Catherine had quietly admired during her first few days. But this morning, that smile was entirely obliterated. Her eyes were swollen and rimmed with furious red rings, and her shoulders shook with the unmistakable, violent tremors of someone desperately trying to suppress a complete emotional collapse. Ashley practically ignored Catherine, moving mechanically toward the sleek espresso machine, her hands shaking so violently she dropped the small silver capsule twice before securing it. Catherine paused her scrubbing, gently setting the plastic spray bottle down on the counter, instantly shifting from a silent observer to a deeply concerned human being. She watched as Ashley clutched the steaming ceramic mug with both hands, drawing it close to her chest, as if seeking physical warmth to counteract a profound internal freeze. Catherine stepped slightly closer, her voice dropping to a soft, grounding register that carried an inherent, maternal authority. She asked the young woman if she was all right, holding her gaze with a steady, unflinching empathy that demanded a truthful answer. Ashley blinked, visibly shocked that the anonymous cleaning woman had dared to cross the invisible barrier to offer genuine comfort. Ashley attempted a brave, dismissive smile, The tragic kind of smile that requires immense muscular effort and fools absolutely no one. She whispered that she was completely fine, but the fragile lie shattered instantly as a single tear escaped and traced a shining line down her pale cheek. Catherine did not push for details. She simply remained standing near the sink, projecting a silent, immovable presence that communicated absolute safety in a building entirely devoid of it. Sometimes, Catherine knew, shattered people do not need brilliant advice or corporate resources. They simply need another human being to witness their pain without judgment. The silence stretched for a long minute before Ashley finally broke, her voice a ragged, defeated whisper. She confessed that Margaret had humiliated her mercilessly in front of the entire trading floor, screaming at her over a single, insignificant decimal point buried deep within a secondary appendix. Ashley continued, the words spilling out in a frantic rush, explaining how Margaret had questioned her basic intelligence, suggesting she was entirely unqualified to work in the financial sector. The public dressing down had lasted for 10 excruciating minutes, designed specifically to strip Ashley of her dignity, while the rest of the team was forced to watch in paralyzed silence. Catherine listened to the entire horrifying account, her expression calm, but her internal resolve solidifying into unbreakable steel. When Ashley finally ran out of breath, Catherine simply looked at her and said, "I am so incredibly sorry," infusing those few words with a profound, resonant sincerity. Ashley nodded slowly, wiping her face with a rough paper towel, seemingly drawing a tiny fraction of strength from the unexpected validation. She straightened her posture slightly and walked back out into the terrifying arena, completely unaware that the woman holding the sponge had just sealed her manager's fate. The climax of the undercover operation occurred barely 2 hours later, directly in the center of the main northern corridor. Catherine was carefully organizing the colorful bottles on the top tier of her metal cart, double-checking the inventory of paper supplies. Suddenly, the unmistakable, sharp clicking of Margaret Vance's high heels echoed down the hallway, moving with aggressive, punishing speed. It was a terrible sound that triggered an immediate, Pavlovian physical response from every employee within earshot. Backs stiffened, eyes locked onto computer monitors, and breathing became shallow. Margaret was practically sprinting, her eyes glued to a glowing digital tablet, carrying a massive, steaming paper cup of dark roast coffee in her right hand. She radiated pure, concentrated fury, clearly agitated by an email that had displeased her, blind to anything existing outside of her immediate rage. Catherine smoothly pulled her heavy cart flush against the wall, leaving more than enough space for 3 people to pass comfortably side by side. It was not enough for Margaret, who drifted recklessly toward the edge of the hallway, her attention entirely consumed by the illuminated screen. Margaret's hip violently clipped the protruding metal corner of the cleaning cart, throwing her off balance for a fraction of a second. The sudden jolt caused the flimsy plastic lid of her coffee cup to dislodge, sending a massive, dark wave of scalding liquid flying through the air in a perfect arc. The boiling coffee splashed heavily onto Catherine's worn black shoes, saturating her socks, and pooled rapidly across the pristine white marble floor. The entire floor froze in collective horror. Analysts stopped typing, managers held their breath, and absolute, terrifying silence descended upon the cubicles. Margaret briefly glanced down at the spreading brown puddle, then slowly raised her cold, dead eyes to meet Catherine's calm, unwavering gaze. There was absolutely no shock in the manager's expression, no trace of a basic human apology, only the calculating irritation of someone whose path had been momentarily obstructed by trash. With a voice devoid of any emotion, dripping with pure entitlement, Margaret pointed at the mess and ordered Catherine to clean it up immediately. Catherine stared back, holding the eye contact for a dangerous, insubordinate second, her mind permanently burning the image of Margaret's cruelty into her memory. Catherine politely agreed, retrieving her mop and slowly cleaning the marble, while dozens of terrified employees, including a heartbroken Ashley, watched the humiliation unfold. As Catherine wiped the floor spotless, She made her final, irrevocable decision. The era of Margaret Vance was officially over. Friday morning dawned with a strange, electric energy humming beneath Catherine's calm exterior as she arrived at the loading dock for her final undercover shift. She wore the same baggy blue uniform, but her eyes held a dangerous, crystalline clarity that belonged to a predator, patiently waiting for the trap to spring. Dorothy greeted her with the usual exhausted nod, complaining about the damp chill in the air, completely oblivious to the massive storm gathering in the building. Catherine collected her heavy cart and rode the service elevator in total silence, but this time her actions deviated sharply from the established routine. She reached deep into the hidden compartment of her canvas backpack and pulled out her primary executive smartphone, a sleek device she had not powered on in nearly 2 weeks. Standing alone in the dim light of the janitorial supply closet, Catherine rapidly typed a highly encrypted, priority message to her assistant, Matthew. She ordered him to schedule a mandatory, extreme emergency meeting of the board of directors for Monday at 9 in the morning on the 14th floor. She explicitly instructed him to compel the attendance of every single board member, allowing absolutely no exceptions or excuses for the upcoming national holiday weekend. Furthermore, she demanded that the comprehensive legal dossier regarding the 12th floor be printed, bound, and placed perfectly on the mahogany table. She hit send, watched the confirmation mark appear, powered down the device, and buried it back in her bag. The silent countdown had officially begun, and Catherine stepped out into the hallway to perform her final hours of menial labor with terrifying precision. She did not have to wait long for Margaret to provide the final, devastating piece of evidence needed to justify an immediate termination. At 10:15 in the morning, Margaret suddenly ordered an impromptu, mandatory assembly of the entire operations team in the center of the open floor. There was no calendar invitation, no reserved conference room, and absolutely no respect for the workflow of the people desperately trying to finish their weekly tasks. Catherine slowly pushed her cart into a strategic position near the decorative ferns, polishing the glass walls while maintaining a perfect auditory line to the gathering. Margaret stood before her 12 exhausted employees, her tablet clutched tightly in her hand, radiating a calculated, freezing disappointment that was far more intimidating than a screaming rage. Margaret began her assault without a single pleasantry, instantly declaring that the departmental revenue numbers for the week were completely, utterly unacceptable. She stated that the financial closing was exactly 3 percentage points below the aggressive projections, a minor variance that in any healthy company would be a simple point of discussion. Margaret deliberately refused to name a specific culprit, instead launching a psychological attack designed to infect the entire team with suffocating paranoia and mutual suspicion. She coldly announced that as punishment for this collective failure, the entire team was required to generate a massive, comprehensive recovery plan containing real metrics and binding commitments. The devastating catch was that she demanded this colossal project be delivered to her desk by Monday morning, completely annihilating their planned holiday weekend. From the back of the terrified group, Samuel, an incredibly talented senior analyst who had dedicated 4 years of his life to the firm, tentatively raised his hand. His voice was steady but laced with a desperate exhaustion, as he respectfully reminded Margaret that Monday was a mandatory national holiday, and the office was officially closed. Margaret did not even blink, her response arriving with the speed and lethality of a striking serpent, slicing through his legitimate concern. She stated that national holidays only applied to employees who actually completed their assigned tasks, and since Samuel had failed, his holiday was officially cancelled. She dismissed the meeting with a sharp wave of her hand, turning her back on 12 shattered people who were now facing a grueling weekend of unpaid, punitive labor. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed the meeting was the most tragic sound Catherine had ever heard during her entire tenure as a chief executive. She watched as the team slowly trudged back to their cubicles, their shoulders slumped, their faces pale masks of absolute defeat, and quiet despair. They were good, dedicated people who had finally accepted that their hard work would never be enough, and that their personal lives were entirely subject to a tyrant's whim. Ashley slowly walked past Catherine's cart to throw a crumpled piece of paper into the trash, pausing for a fraction of a second without making eye contact. Ashley whispered into the empty air that this was the standard Friday routine, a deliberate strategy to break their spirits so they would return on Monday completely exhausted. Catherine did not respond verbally, but she locked eyes with Ashley for a brief moment, her gaze promising a retribution that the young analyst could not possibly comprehend. The subsequent weekend was a blur of intense, highly classified preparation. Inside Catherine's secure penthouse apartment, overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline, Matthew arrived on Saturday morning, carrying 3 massive, heavily encrypted binders, containing the horrifying truth of Margaret's 3-year reign of terror. Eleanor Moore, the brilliant legal director, joined them an hour later to ensure every single action they planned was completely bulletproof under state labor laws. They reviewed the suppressed exit interviews, the staggering medical leaves related to severe stress, and the manipulated performance reviews designed to deny earned bonuses. By Sunday evening, the impenetrable legal snare was set. The termination documents were meticulously drafted, and a complete restructuring plan was finalized. Catherine stared out at the dark waters of the lake, feeling the cold, hard certainty of a leader who was about to permanently alter the destiny of her people. Monday morning broke with a brilliant, piercing sunrise that flooded the financial district with golden light, a stark contrast to the dark storm about to hit the executive levels. Catherine arrived at the soaring glass entrance of Apex Conglomerate at exactly 6:47, but this time the heavy service doors remained firmly locked. She walked directly through the grand main lobby, her designer trench coat flowing behind her, her posture radiating absolute, terrifying authority. Charles, the veteran head of security, immediately recognized the chief executive officer, his eyes widening slightly as he deactivated the biometric turnstiles with a rapid swipe of his MasterCard. He offered a deeply respectful greeting, completely unaware that the elegantly dressed billionaire striding past him was the exact same woman who had pushed a mop through the lobby just 3 days prior. Catherine stepped into the private, velvet-lined executive elevator, inserted her golden access card, and pressed the heavy brass button for the 14th floor. The doors slid silently shut, and as the high-speed cabin shot upward, she finally allowed the persona of the silent cleaner to fully merge with the ruthless corporate titan. When the doors opened, Matthew was waiting precisely at the reception desk, holding a steaming cup of her preferred black coffee and a leather-bound briefing folder. He quietly confirmed that the entire board of directors had been sequestered in the main conference room for the past 20 minutes, severely agitated by the unprecedented emergency summons. He also confirmed that Margaret Vance had been ordered to report to the 14th floor exactly 15 minutes after the meeting began, under the guise of an urgent operational review. Catherine gathered the board and revealed that she had secretly spent 2 weeks working as a contracted janitor to uncover the truth about the company's toxic culture, presenting overwhelming evidence, including high employee turnover, ignored HR complaints, widespread abuse, and serious legal risks. She demanded the immediate dismissal of Margaret Vance and a complete restructuring of middle management. The board unanimously approved her decision. When Margaret arrived expecting to discuss business results, she was horrified to discover that the cleaning woman she had humiliated was actually the company's CEO. Catherine calmly recounted Margaret's abusive behavior, emphasized that profits could never justify destroying employees' dignity, and officially terminated her employment. Margaret signed the dismissal papers and left the company in disgrace. Catherine then returned to the 12th floor, canceled the impossible holiday workload, and introduced herself to the stunned employees as both the company's owner and the woman who had cleaned alongside them. She promised a safer workplace, stronger reporting channels, and a culture built on respect rather than fear. Over the following weeks, she met with every employee, promoted Samuel after recognizing his talent and compassion, and began restoring trust across the department. As teamwork, confidence, and kindness gradually replaced fear, Catherine realized she had saved the company not by improving financial reports, but by protecting the people who made the business possible. She left with the conviction that true leadership is measured by the dignity, respect, and safety offered to every employee, especially those whose contributions are often overlooked.